Today I'd like to share with you some hot tips on hot LAMS. The emphasis is on that term enhanced. So what enhanced means is we are using micro wires that run radially on both sides of this nose cone bougie tip, and these micro wires converge at the tip itself. These micro wires comprise only 3% of the surface area, and that is what allows us to achieve a maximal cutting effect while minimizing the coagulation effect. So we want to minimize the collateral thermal damage that we get when we use diathermy. And this took a long time to develop, and I worked a very long time with the engineers to find a modality that would allow us to have more of the cutting effect like a scalpel. Also importantly, the platform is endoscopist controlled, which of course we endosonographers are used to when we perform FNA. It is a one-hand platform, a one-device platform, and one puncture platform. It's not necessarily one step. There are several steps during the procedure. But we called it, within our company, Lumina, we called it the OB-1. Well, those of us that are Star Wars fans, the OB-1 with emphasis on one hand, one device, one puncture. So the development of this handle was because it required great focus and ingenuity, because there's no room for error when you're placing a 10-millimeter saddle across two walls. And in hindsight, I'm actually quite pleased that the original 3D printed mold, which you see here, this is over 10 years ago, really hasn't changed. And so it has passed the test of time. And even after Boston Scientific acquired Lumina, it still looks the same, only the logo has changed at the bottom. So let's deconstruct that Axios handle, because I think it's very important for the audience to understand how this was constructed. And even though you have the steps that you're taught, I think you need to understand what's inside. So we have these two hubs, the black and the gray. That black advances and retracts the sheath. I put that in quotes because technically that's not really what happens. It's able to advance the sheath only because there's a coupling with the gray hub. So as long as the gray hub here and the black hub are coupled, then the sheath can be advanced as one unit. But the black is actually advancing an inner catheter. As long as it's joined coupled with the outer sheath, it moves as one. The gray then deploys the flanges. We have two locks for the respective black hub and gray hubs, and there's an added yellow safety pin. We added that later because it's so critical that the gray hub is locked. If it's not locked, you cannot advance the sheath as one unit. And then you're all familiar with the 4 steps, which are actually printed on the handle itself. So if you're ever flustered, you can look at those 4 steps. I won't go into the steps right now. I think you're familiar with it. But what is key is that you pay attention to the locks. And using those locks conscientiously is key to safe deployment. So basically, you're alternating lock and unlock the entire time. So if you have something locked, you must have the other unlocked and vice versa. So the gray lock keeps the sheath and the inner catheter coupled, as I mentioned, and it allows the black hub to advance the sheath into the target as one unit. It also allows the black hub to be retracted to deploy the distal, to snug up the distal flange to the wall. So you're using that distal flange like a retractor and you're pulling it up against the wall. The black lock is what prevents movement of the inner catheter during flange deployment. There is a two-stage release of the distal and proximal flange independent of one another. Now, this is the very critical part because there is no room for error. So we built in these safety measures, safety features to ensure that these steps are done completely independent of one another. Stage one is to release the distal flange in your target, gallbladder, for example. And so here you see that we've retracted the gray hub, and that has deployed the distal flange in the target. And here, up here, you can see the distal flange deployed. Now, we built in an auto lock, so you don't even have to think about locking this because it's so critical that we now immediately lock the gray hub, and there's an audible click that tells you that gray hub is now locked. And then we can move to stage two, which is to release the proximal flange in the bowel. So here you see the entire Axios deployed. Then the proximal flange has been deployed by pulling that gray hub fully back. But what's important is not to forget that step two. That's step three, between step 2 and step 4. That is to retract the black hub to snug up. And here you can see the number 3. Now, often we don't have to conscientiously pay too much attention if you have a smaller space, a tighter space, let's say 3 to 4 centimeters, because the distal flange usually automatically snugs up. But it is very critical that you snug up, pull back the distal flange if you're in a more capacious space. If you ever get lost, look for the black band marker. So we created this so that you can always identify the distal tip of the sheath. That's what you always need to know. Where is the distal tip of the sheath? And you can identify that endoscopically, you can identify that with ultrasound, and you can identify that on fluoroscopy. We're really integrating all of the 3 imaging modalities that makes our work as endosonographers and ERCPists so exciting. So here you see the black marker. That means the tip of the sheath is here, and now we need to deploy the proximal flange. Or you can see the black marker here, and also this radio-opaque marker here on fluoroscopy. So look for the black mark. Now I'm going to share some hot tips and we'll start with number 1. You need to know your target, and that really starts with reviewing the imaging studies before you do the procedure. So you should be reviewing the CT scan, if there's an MRI done, looking for the amount of necroses, for example, in walled-off necroses. And you need to know the lumen dimensions and their contents. You need to interrogate for the interposed tissue, the distance, and the vessels, and you need to have some appreciation of adherence. So the lumen dimensions, and I say dimensions, not just size, because you need to look at the cross diameter, and you want that minimum cross diameter to be greater than the flange diameter. And the minimum longitudinal diameter, which should always be measured in the trajectory of your puncture path. I call that the runway. I'm going to show you what I mean by runway. That longitudinal diameter here needs to be longer than the projected runway. So here, you're familiar with this, the saddle length. It comes in 2 and 50 millimeters, shown here. The lumen diameter of the Axios comes in sizes from 6 millimeters all the way to 20 millimeters. And you have the flange diameter. So you all know the lumen diameter, but you don't know the flange diameter. The flange diameter is a multiple of the lumen diameter, and it's a 1.5 to 2-fold multiple. And it's actually inversely proportionate to the lumen diameter. So if you have a 10 millimeter LAMS, the flange is 21 millimeters, so it's 2 times. But if you have a 20 millimeter LAMS, it's really 1.5 times. So it's not 40 millimeters, the runway that you need, it's 30 millimeters. So the runway for distal flange deployment is just something that you have to keep in the back of your mind. So here you can see we have deployed the distal flange. This is the runway. This is the extent to which that inner catheter needs to be extended from the tip of the sheath to release the distal flange. So you can see, for example, with a 10 by 10 LAMS, that runway distance is 32 millimeters. So the runway, if you want to give it an approximation, it's the lumen size times 2 to 3 fold. So as you're inspecting the lumen, you have to anticipate how much runway you're going to need to deploy that distal flange safely in your target. Lumen contents, you need to have a sufficient pocket of liquid for distal flange deployment. I emphasize liquid. It has to be liquid, it has to be hypo or anechoic. You should avoid thermal contact with solid shadowing content because calcium, present in wand, obviously present in stones, absorbs current. You need to select a LAMS size that's proportionate to the contents requiring drainage. For walled-off necroses, I always use a 20 millimeter. Now, one of the tricks that you should always use is to pre-infuse with saline if you need to increase your target size. I use a 19-gauge FNA needle that's primed with saline so you don't inject any gas into your target. So here you see the syringe attached to the FNA needle, and as soon as you're inside of your target, you switch out for your water pump, and then you infuse saline until you achieve the desired target size. So here in this contracted gallbladder, which is very frequent after patients have had a percutaneous cholecystostomy, we are distending that with infusion of saline to then place a 10 millimeter Axios. Review or interrogate the interposed tissue, measure the distance, and look for vessels that are in the trajectory of your FNA path or your puncture path. And here you can see the distance exceeds 10 millimeters, so you may need to select a 15 millimeter saddle length. Target adherence, firstly, be aware whether the patient has ascites. You may not see it when you on ultrasound, but it's always possible as soon as you're starting your puncture that ascites may come in the way. So look for an interposed ascites. Here you can see the gallbladder is literally floating in ascites. This is not a gallbladder you want to drain internally. Look for the echogenic layer, which represents fat that is between the target and the wall. That is not really adherent. It is fat tissue. And you can press on the abdomen, jiggle a little bit to see if the target moves independent of the wall. So get some appreciation of the target. Now, hot tip number 2 is know your cautery. You always use pure cutting current. Remember, we want to use this like a surgeon's scalpel. You can increase the voltage if there is difficult penetration, a lot of fibrosis, for example, or if the wall is very thick. You advance your catheter into the target slowly with steady pressure. I call this the SSS technique, slow, steady, smooth. This is not FNA. You're not thrusting your needle in. You're very slowly advancing. I think that is the most common error that's made. We're used to doing FNA and pushing very forcefully. This needs to be slow, steady, and smooth. Stop and retract if there's any interposed gas that impairs your ultrasound view. Look for bubbles. Bubbles is the indicator that you've entered your target. That's the diathermy effect on fluid. Then immediately stop your advancement. And you should immediately disconnect your cautery cable after you enter into your target so you don't accidentally cause any injury to the opposite wall. As happened to me in this example, I drained the gallbladder and I had perforated the opposite wall. I could see, you can see this looking through the LAMS, that perforation. Fortunately, I was able to close this with just a single clip and the patient did just fine. So you need to be aware that perforation of the opposite wall can occur, but if you go inside of the target, you can usually treat that. know when to preload with a guide wire. I don't often do this, but the beginner certainly should. It's a safety net to retain access if for any reason there's maldeployment. It will deflect your nose cone away from the opposite wall. So if you're in a more restricted space, for example, the gallbladder or the bile duct, then you may want to deflect your nose cone into the axis of your target organ, the bile duct, for example. This is where the guide wire is very helpful. It will orient the direction of the distal flange deployment. And hot tip number 4, know when to manage maldeployment. So I just want to spend a few extra moments emphasizing this. You need to already prepare before you start your procedure. Consider, what will I do if there is a maldeployment? You need to be prepared. The most common in 2/3 of cases is what's called type 1, and I differentiate a type 1A from a type 1B. Now that's my classification, but the type 1A would be where the proximal flange has not yet deployed, so it's still inside of the sheath. Here, you can actually resheath the distal flange. It's open, but you can resheath it. What's important, though, is that after you've resheathed and pulled it back into, let's say, the stomach when doing a gastroenterostomy, that you don't pull it immediately into the working channel. You need to make sure that the sheath and the nose cone are flush with each other. Otherwise, it'll get stuck in the working channel. Type 1B is where the proximal flange is already deployed. Well, then you have to remove the Axios, and you can close the hole and start all over. Type 2, in 1/3 of the cases, again, I have 2 types, 2A and 2B. Type 2A is where you placed a guide wire. You were smart beforehand as your safety net, and you can just insert a second stent, typically a tubular stent, although you could use now a longer saddle LAMS. Type 2B, you have no guide wire, you have to remove the Axios. You should definitely give your surgeon a call, because it's possible that you're going to get some leak, although usually these holes do close on their own. And finally, the type 3 is the most dreaded. This is where the proximal flange has released into the peritoneum, and you may then get drainage of contents into the peritoneum with contamination. There, you really do need to have your surgeon on board. This is just how you resheath the distal flange. It's actually very simple. We created a safety latch here so that you don't accidentally resheath when you're doing the procedure, but if you need to, you can press here on this latch. Here's the gray hub, and it will automatically lock. So you leave it locked, and then you just depress that latch on the side and advance the sheath forward. Perhaps during the live, I can show you how that's done. It's a very simple maneuver. But just remember that you need to be sure that it is fully retracted before removing it through the working channel. So here you can see that the gray hub is now below that latch. Finally, you need to be prepared to close that hole, and you need to close it robustly. My preference is to use the over-the-scope clamp. I found that this gives me the greatest reliability in terms of robust closure. Yes, you can use clips, but I really do recommend over-the-scope clamping. And you can see here, this is where a gastroenterostomy went bad. I removed the Axios. I wasn't inside of the small bowel, and you can just close that hole very quickly and start all over. These patients almost never have any issues afterwards. Finally, primum non nocere. That's what our father Hippocrates taught us: first, do no harm. The high surgical risk patients, these are the patients that are sent to us. These are the patients who will benefit the most from these interventional endoscopy procedures that we perform, but they are also the patients who fare the worst if they need emergency surgery. So we must always keep in the back of the mind that we really have to have a close to 100% success record when we're doing this. Otherwise, we haven't done our patients a favor. And I leave you greetings from San Francisco, and here I am with my mentor, Albert, sitting next to me, and I look forward to sharing with you other innovative ideas during the meeting. Thank you.